There we go. Hey, there we go. Good man.
I think we're live.
Excellent. Well, thanks for everybody for if you're joining us live via satellite at home or wherever you're watching this. Is great. Thank you very much for folks for coming today. A little bit of a change in program right off the top. If you're expected to see my friends Charlie Demers or Sam Wiebe, unfortunately, they're riding the bench today. They're sick. Sam did a COVID test this morning and realized he got COVID. I think he's okay. I don't think he's feeling terrible in that, but just enough that it was obviously a concern. He didn't want to come out in public. And then yesterday, Charlie Demers' personal business manager and assistant and promoter, Joji, his daughter, unfortunately contracted COVID. So he had to miss a comedy show he was supposed to do last night and today. So in lieu of that, the one original guest we had still had program, Lalli was here, thankfully. I was going to make a joke because some of us are writing about crime or thrillers that the other two were bumped off mysteriously, and we'll have to solve a murder mystery to find out what happened to Sam and Charlie. But I didn't want to maybe take advantage of that.
That's very noir of you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So our panel today is urban noir, and those of us standing in, but can't replace, of course, those two gentlemen. We have SM Friedman here, and myself, Aaron Chapman, and I'm sort of jumping in as moderator. We're all authors here, though, so I think what our plan is to do today is to do a short reading of all our books, and I'll ask some questions. Maybe we'll have some questions for each other, and we'll have some time at the end for you if you have some questions as well. If you were counting and your whole month depended on seeing Sam and Charlie today, if you do want to leave now, we won't be offended. If you do want to turn off your live stream, but before you do that, it's going to get real exciting. It's going to get very interesting here because I think we all have some stories that you're going to find interesting and stuff we're sharing here. I'm going to read. I'm going to sort of read some just off the top, just to read. Let me see. Just read some bios on everybody here, and then we'll maybe go down the line reading or up the line
Sounds
reading
good.
or whatever. Yeah. S.C. Lalli is the author of "Are You Sarah?" There we go. Hold that up. A national bestseller, one of the NPR and Apple's best books of 2022. An author of Punjabi and Bengali heritage, she also writes romance and women's fiction novels under her full name. Should we give that away?
It's not a secret.
It's not a secret.
Sonya
Okay,
Lalli
yeah,
is my real
Sonya
name.
Lalli, yeah. She studied law in her hometown of Saskatoon, Canada, great town, and at Columbia University in New York. Sonya has worked in law, legal journalism, and book publishing. She lives in Vancouver with her husband and her mini golden doodle, Joey. How is Joey right now? Do you know?
She's good. This is her.
Oh, there we go. I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about Joey. And down at the very end of the table here, SM Friedman. Mystery and thriller author SM Friedman studied acting in New York and spent a decade as a private investigator on the not-so-mean streets of Vancouver before returning to her first love, writing. She's the author of the Amazon #1 bestseller, The Faithful, which made the quarterfinals in the Amazon Breakthrough Novel Award and was selected by Suspense Magazine as the best debut of the year. Impact writer, and the day she died, or pardon me, let me read that sentence again, which made the breakthrough finals in the Amazon Breakthrough Novel of the Year and was selected by Suspense Magazine as the best debut of the year, Impact writer, and the day she died. Her most recent psychological thriller, Blood Atonement, is about a woman who escaped an isolated religious sect and must determine if her altered personality is a murderer or if she was going to be the next victim. Which was selected as a top 100 best books of 22 by the Globe and Mail, chosen by the Vancouver Sun and the province as one of the 5 books to give this holiday season. It's coming up too. It's a good for every Christmas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a holiday book.
Yeah, and was a finalist in the Crime Writers of Canada Awards of Excellence. And for what it's worth, I suppose myself, I'm going to speak myself in the third person, which is very pompous. Aaron Chapman is an author and historian. He is the author of Vancouver After Dark, The Wild History of a City's Nightlife, winner of the Bill Duthie Bookseller's Choice Award, BC Book Prizes in 2020. The Last Gang in Town, the story of Vancouver's Clark Park Gang. Liquor, Lust, and the Law, the story of Vancouver's Penthouse Nightclub, now available in the second edition. And Vancouver Vice, Crime and Spectacle in the City's West End. and Live at the Commodore, History of the Commodore Ballroom, which also won the book prize, BC Book Prize in 2015. And there's a new edition, which is just right here, as a matter of fact, hot off the presses, which is also being re-released this year in a new updated edition. He was elected as a member of the Royal Historical Society, and he lives in his hometown, born and raised in Vancouver. Maybe SM, do you want to read something from the bunch?
I
too?
think
Or do you
Sonya
want-
should read first, since she is the original.
Let's do that.
Okay,
I'm
the
all
OG.
I'm all-
surviving
OG.
I'm all in
member.
favor. I'm all in favor of that.
Thank you, guys. Even if you were not here to see me, I really appreciate it. So I'm going to read from Are You Sarah? It's my first thriller, but it was my 5th book. And basically, the premise is that 2 women named Sarah meet at a bar. They accidentally take each other's ride share, their Uber, home. So I'm going to jump in the middle of the first chapter, and we follow one of the Sarahs. And she's woken up and realizes that she's at the wrong place. And the other Sarah took her ride home. Just for context, and we can save 10 minutes and not read the first bit. The driver wakes me up, grumbling at me to get out. I attempt to sit up straight, but my head spins. The driver yells at me again. I said, get out. All right, all right. I fling open the car door. Thanks a lot, man. It's dark and I'm cold. I pull my jacket tighter around my body as I try to figure out on which side of Hillmont Road the driver has dropped me. The street is tree-lined, but nothing feels familiar. The trees are taller, leafier, and the houses. I blink at the one in front of me. It's 3 stories high with a cherry red door and window shutters to match. It's what rich people might call colonial. I swivel around as if my small, shitty, there are no children here, so I'm just going to keep the curse words, house will magically appear across the street. My heart sinks. It's another mansion. Damn it. I squat on the curb, more awake now. The cold is clearing my head. Was the driver screwing with me, or did I really get into the wrong ride? I open the app, and sure enough, my ride is on its way to Hillmont Road, with the other Sarah in tow. I scroll outward on the map. The little blue dot tells me I've been dropped off in a rich suburb on the other side of Windermere. I admit defeat and start walking. I wind my way through the suburb, the first of autumn's leaves crunching beneath my sneakers, and finally, I find Main Street. At this end of town, the stores are all selling baby onesies made out of organic fibers and kitchen gadgets that zest lemons and other fruits I didn't know could be zested. I rarely come out this way, and I find myself staring through the windows at all the things nobody needs but everybody wants. At a woman's clothing shop, there's a cardamom green gown on display. I wonder who in this sleepy university town would need to buy a cardamom green gown. Slowly but surely, the streets change. There still isn't a single car on the road, but now Main Street is lined with a mix of coffee shops and restaurants, used bookstores, gyms, other things that rely on students. I walk block after block, and finally I'm getting closer. Not much has survived in this part of Windermere. Besides the occasional nail salon or convenience store, most storefronts are shuttered. When I get to Hillmont, I head east. I'm only 2 blocks away now. I pass a block of rundown apartment complexes, then a daycare, and then I stop. Something feels off. I nod up. I look up. There's an odd humming come up from up ahead. Lights, too. I squint, trying to make it out. I cross the final intersection before my house. I'm only 50 feet away now, and the flashing lights come into focus. It's a police cruiser. Hello? The words come out as a croak, so I clear my throat and keep walking forward. Hello, I try again. My house is tucked away beneath a broken streetlight, and it's dark as hell. A shadowy figure emerges from my front walkway. I tense as it draws closer. Who are you? Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay back. Why? Ma'am, my name is Officer Reynolds, and I'm going to need you to stay where you are. But that's my house. I live there. The officer comes into full view. He's blocking the walkway with his large frame. You live here? 72 Hillmont Road. Why? Just then, somewhere in the distance, a police siren wails, and then another, and another after that. My heart pounds as I realize they're getting closer, and I step off the pavement and push past the officer. Ma'am, no. He grabs my arm, but it's too late. I see her, the familiar denim jacket, the mess of chocolate brown hair dripping down the stoop. I buckle. Do you know her? He asks me. Yes, I say. Her name is Sarah. So that is the first chapter, when she discovers the other Sarah dead on her doorstep. Thank you.
Yeah, see, we just stick with you just for a second before we move on
totally.
to either of us. One thing I thought of with the immediate premise, thoroughly modern premise idea that seems ready for prime time, depiction or whatnot. Did you happen to get an Uber one time, or and somebody else had the same name? Did it start that way, or just an idea in your head?
It was just a very basic concept of, how easy it is to get into the wrong Uber these days. And, how they usually say like, oh, are you Sonya? Are you Jack? And there's sort of a verification that you're in the right car, especially in situations where you're young, you've been drinking, you get into a car. I definitely, when I was living in Toronto, there's these bars on King Street West. And I had this idea when I was outside waiting for my Uber. And I saw another woman waiting across the street, and our Ubers pulled up at the same time, and the cars were similar. And I found myself thinking how easy it could have been for us to just taken the wrong car home and not really noticed for a long time. And there's always these horror stories about women, horrible things that happen to women when they get into taxis or Ubers and stuff. So it was just kind of an idea that I sat with for a few years, and eventually.
Oh, a few years it was in your head.
A few years, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
Uber's been out a long time.
Well, it has, but just the idea, I thought,
Yeah.
so often when you get a notion or an interesting idea, you're arrested by it. Sometimes you'll sit with it for a long time or a short before it gets committed to paper in some way like that. Did you always, this narrative, and I'm not giving any spoilers away here, I think, but the viewpoint between the two Sarahs alternates in chapters. Did you always have that idea that you were going to attack it that way, or did that come as you were trying to figure out, piecing it together?
I always knew that the surviving Sarah, she's I would say 80% of the novel is written from the surviving Sarah's point of view. But I think it was important for the other Sarah to come in because, she dies, the other Sarah dies in the very first chapter. And there's really no, you don't really have any sympathy for her because the things that you hear during the investigation about what this girl was really like, why was she out so late? Why didn't one really notice? You kind of would get a very biased opinion of what this girl was really like. And so we see her story and sort of get clues of what really happened to her and, why was she was in this situation from diary entries, basically, that we go back and see. So I think it was important to show both sides of the story.
And how do you deal with sort of character likability in that sense? Is that just something that you sort of thought of beforehand coming in? Because one of the interesting views I saw when I read the book is some people said, well, I didn't find these characters likable. I was fascinated with the whole story, but I didn't find them likable. And maybe they didn't get it, as well. But I'm curious to see what you would say.
Yeah, I think the great thing about this genre is that you don't have to like the main character.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily reading because you're rooting for them. You are reading because often you want to know who the killer is. You want to know what the whole thing unfold. And so I started writing romance and women's fiction. And one thing I hated was that I had to write likable characters. My most common, when I'd hand a book in and my editor would say, she's not really that nice here. And, she doesn't come across great. I was like, well, that's, in my head, I was thinking that's the point. She's real. I mean, if we all took our most terrible moments, we'd come across badly. So I liked that I had more freedom to write people who are morally compromised.
Right. So ARE YOU SARA, this is now we can
she's
all those
really
urges
bad.
out.
All those urges.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing I found interesting is I guess you wrote this during the pandemic. Is that right? And it's also set in a town that is not your hometown. I don't know how well you know that area well.
It's I don't know at all.
Yeah, that you were. I thought it was interesting that you were doing a lot of sort of online Google Street mapping, and it's just to sort of get an idea. Why did you set it in a town that you know, or town you grew up in, or town like Vancouver? All my stuff is set in Vancouver, so I always find it interesting if somebody's going to tackle a city that is not their immediate area. Yeah.
So all my books I've set in different cities. So I have set one of my rom-coms in Vancouver, in Toronto, and Washington, D.C., in different cities that I like or have lived in. And the one reason I chose to set this in the U.S. is because one of the themes is sort of, well, I don't want to give it away, but part of the importance of the novel is this idea of the time period that we're in, and we're set in this post-Trump political time period, which it's not about that, but it definitely feeds into some of the character motivations and some of the stuff that happens. So I wanted to set it in the U.S. because because of that,
Hmm.
particularly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And did you? I found it. I wrote Vancouver Vice, which is my most recent book, right during the pandemic, and it's a true story. So I found it amazing during the pandemic. And anytime I was trying to track somebody down for an interview, when I would call them, they would pick up. It wasn't as though, well, he's on holiday for 2 weeks, you'll have to find him, or he's not around. Everybody was around because everybody was at home, and it was easy to find people. Was it easy for you during a pandemic? Was it hard or?
I didn't do any phone interviews
Yeah.
because it's more.
This is a novel, of course. So
Yeah,
it's
not.
gonna
It's
be,
not a detective novel. It's
Yeah.
told from the perspective of like a normal person. It's told from the perspective of a law student.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the details that often in crime require a lot of research, you can kind of gloss over a little bit,
Yeah.
depending on the.
I guess I
point of
more mean
view.
to say,
Oh, yeah.
in terms of writing during that whole period, I actually found it pretty easy because it gave me something to do.
Mhm.
I know a lot of other people just basically watched everything on Netflix and were bored at home or waited to go out and do something. And it was only actually once I finished, I felt like I sort of identified with what everybody else had been sort of living with for 18 months.
Right.
It's sort of the idea of or the task of working on a book and the day-to-day task of doing it sort of gives you something to do.
Mhm.
But I know other people struggled with it or had different issues, or especially maybe they got families, got more than
Yeah.
just themselves, or a dog to watch over and things like that. Was it difficult for you at all, or did that help give you something to do? I guess.
It definitely helped give me something to do. I was very lucky that it was just my husband and I,
Yeah.
no dog yet, in
okay.
our apartment, and
Right.
so it gave me something to do that wasn't watching the news, that wasn't like work wasn't busy or whatever.
Right.
But I also found that writing romance, women's fiction, which I do tackle serious issues in those books, but at the end of the day, there's a happy ever after. It's uplifting, and I wasn't really in the space to write that. So writing something a little darker,
in that sense, yeah.
and about a girl who's mean a lot of the time. It was
Perfect.
That was perfect for me.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Great. SM, do you want to?
Yeah.
You know what? I have to say, first of all, that this on Are You Sarah is one of my favorite books that I read in 2022.
Oh, thank you.
So it's just, and one of the things I loved about it was the legal aspect, because she's a law student. Like I actually learned quite a bit, which I kind of love when I'm reading something and you're invested emotionally and you love the characters, and the characters are so well drawn out.
Oh, thank you.
And also sympathetic, but also sometimes not so sympathetic, but still really interesting. So you want to keep following them. But I loved the legal aspect, and I was curious. You have a background in law?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I went to law school. I worked for a year and then didn't after that. So yeah, I definitely took a lot of some of my own experiences. And one thing that is speaking of like the legal life, I remember when I was working, it was a law firm, and it was a great place to work. But all of the partners were older men, and a lot of the younger lawyers were younger women. And I was 23 or 24, and I had a great experience personally, but not everybody in my situation did. And the power dynamics between having an older male boss and a really younger female lawyer, it always really struck me as like an interesting place for fiction, not necessarily something that was sexual, because it's not like that in the book at all, but it was like the power dynamics and flipping of those power dynamics was always something that I wanted to write about. So that's a big element of this story as well.
That's a great element.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So I think I've read from these are my latest two books. This is The Day She Died, which is my pandemic baby. So I just read from that at the pandemic launch. And then this is my most recent, which is Blood Atonement. And as you already know, it hit the Globe and Mail's top 100 best books of the year. And thank you.
It's great.
And yeah, and I thought it was hilarious when the Vancouver Sun and the province did the 5 best books to gift this holiday season, because it's really, if you like, it's dark for a holiday, but some people like that. And I like that. So I am going to read from the beginning of Blood Atonement. And so this is a book that tells the story of a woman named Grace. And she escapes at the age of 18 from an isolated sect of the FLDS, or the Fundamental Mormon Church. So if you don't know what that is, think Netflix's Keep Sweet, Pray, and Obey, or Under the Banner of Heaven. And she leads 9 other children on an escape from this isolated sect up in rural BC. And but because of the trauma she's endured in her childhood, which I write about, but I keep the actual trauma off the page to be respectful. She suffers from dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. And so years later, when the other children that she escaped with begin to die under suspicious circumstances, one of Grace's alter personalities becomes the prime suspect. And she has to determine whether she's actually a murderer or if she's about to be the next victim. So I'm going to read from the prologue because the story does go back and forth in time through her past and her growing up in this sect, and then in her present when she's trying to deal with, figuring things out and this possible threat to her life. And the prologue is actually the bridge between her past and her present. It's the moment when she musters up the courage to do something that she could never have imagined doing, which is to escape from this sect that she's lived in. She's never been outside of their boundary walls in all her life, and to lead other kids out of their confinement as well. So this is the moment when she kind of becomes a hero. Grace was cleaning blood from her thighs when the police raided Brigham for the last time. At first, she paid little attention to the shouting outside the trailer window. She needed to finish what she was doing before her husband came home demanding dinner. She'd propped herself over the toilet, one hip wedged into the side of the sink and her back pressed against the shower door. Her legs shook, her hands trembled, her brain was hot with fever and her good ear buzzed. Someone pounded on the side of the trailer, causing the walls to rattle. She lurched backward and grabbed the edge of the sink to keep from falling. Bloody rags splatted on the floor. "Grace, hurry! The police are here," Desiree said. The police. Now she heard the shouting, the crying, the chaos as children scattered into the forest. "I'm here! I'm coming! Be quick!" Her dress hung from the hook by the sink, pale green with yellowed lace trim. But there was no time for her to get dressed. She grabbed a throw blanket from the foot of the bed and wrapped it around herself to cover her blood-soaked temple undergarments. The world tipped sideways and slowly righted itself. Staggering forward, she somehow made it to the door and slammed a shoulder into it, unsticking the warped aluminum from its frame. She tumbled off balance down the outside stairs and would have fallen if her sister hadn't caught her. "Come on!" Desiree grabbed her arm and pulled. They ran beneath a moon that was low and bright in the sky. Once Grace's eyes adjusted, she could see perfectly well, which meant she could also be seen perfectly well. At the edge of the cornfield, reason or madness asserted itself. "Wait!" Desiree spun to face her, her eyes wide with panic. "What are you doing? We have to go." Her sister's hair was pulled into a classic roll on top of her head and braided down her back. She panted, her bosom pressed against the cotton of her high-colored dress. Pimples dotted her chin. How long until Uncle G had a revelation about Desiree's marriage? She was already a year older than Grace had been. Desiree glanced toward the road. "Come on, they're catching up." This was true. The beams of their flashlights danced like fireflies as the police approached. Their voices grew louder. She felt Desiree's panic, could feel it swell within her own chest. The urge to keep running was almost overwhelming. It's what they'd been taught to do. They needed to protect their way of life, their chance at heaven, their profit. But blood trickled down her legs again. And more than anything, she wanted a better life for her sister. She grabbed Desiree's hands. Hers blazed with fever. Desiree's felt like ice. "This is our chance." Realization and fear blossomed in Desiree's eyes. She shook her head and tried to pull her hands free. "We shouldn't." Grace squeezed. "We must. But what about father and mother?" Grace's chest tightened with anxiety and guilt, but she shook her head. Too far down that path and she'd decide to stay. Then her only way out would be death. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Truth was so hard to speak. She'd been raised to be sweet, and the words burned like acid on her tongue. She almost gagged on the enormity of what escaped her lips. "If I have to stay here any longer, I'll die, and so will you. How long until you're married?" "Oh, Grace." Desiree's eyes swam with tears. "You're 14. Your revelation is coming any day now. Maybe I'll be lucky like our parents were. Until Mother Rebecca joined the family." Desiree swallowed hard. Was it just a game to you? Grace asked. The police drew closer, the beams from their flashlights weaving and flickering. I know you're scared, but we can't waste this chance. The others will be waiting for us. Desiree licked her lips, bobbing her head up and down. All right, if they're really there, I'll do it. She wrapped an arm around her sister's waist, and together they ran along the edge of the cornfield. As Grace had predicted, the others were huddled beneath the scarecrow on the far end. But a quick head count told her only 8 had made it. Grace rubbed a trembling hand across her brow, and it came away wet. Her bones felt hollow, and she could barely hear over the ringing in her good ear. Where's Soraya? No answer, just 8 sets of eyes begging for her leadership. Oh no, Soraya! We need to go look for her. The police lights grew distant, but somewhere nearby, men shouted. It sounded like Uncle Red and maybe Joseph Barlow. They'd be rounding up the children, herding them to the forest. There's no time, we have to go, Rulon said. He was Uncle G's 6th son, and her husband's half-brother. They had the same blonde hair and pale eyes, but her husband was salt to Rulon's sugar. Desiree spoke through her fingers. We can't just leave her. It won't be for long, Rulon said. Once we tell our story, they'll come back to rescue the rest. Maybe she's already waiting on the road, Tabby said. Joseph Barlow spotted them and strode across the cornfield in their direction. What are you doing there? All of you, to the forest. Okay, hurry, everyone, buddy up, Grace said. Stay with me. Hey, Barlow called after them. They rolled like thunder across the fields and gravel, linked hand to hand. Grace's legs trembled with exertion, threatening to collapse beneath her, but the others depended on her, so she pushed forward. They made it to the main road with no sign of Soraya. Up close, the police looked terrifying. They moved in formation, wearing dark helmets and thick vests. One by one, she felt the others slow, paralyzed by the same fear that bloomed inside her own chest. This was their enemy in the flesh. Then an officer stepped out of formation and pulled off his helmet. He had a shock of dark hair above a broad face. Their eyes met, and his arms opened as though in welcome. She squeezed Desiree's hand and pulled Tabby close. The girls trembled against her side, thin as sparrows. Don't be afraid. God is with us. She ran toward the officer's open arms, and the children followed.
I think this is a good question for both of you, but I want to start with you. When you're dealing with sort of complex characters, as a writer, and I know sometimes I always think it's interesting at a festival like Word Vancouver, there's people who are readers, but there's also lots of writers in the audience that are also looking for sort of ways in or different ways of working. Yeah. With writing in your book, how much did you map out beforehand, knowing those characters, or did it require some extra research with some of the?
There was a ton of research. Yeah, there was a ton of research. I love research, though. I love falling down those rabbit holes. In particular, with Blood Atonement, I had to research the FLDS because I knew nothing about them.
That was my next question.
Yeah. So I'm just going to take it from
you. Go for it. I love it. Yeah.
I had to research the FLDS. I had to really get a deep understanding of their fundamental beliefs because they are very fundamentalist, for lack of a better word. And I read a lot of memoirs about from kids who had escaped the FLDS to get the personal understanding of what it's like to grow up in some place that's so isolated and so there's so many rules. The women are taught to keep sweet. They're taught to, never even have a thought that isn't kind. That they're the servants of their husbands who are called their priesthood heads, and they truly believe things like the husband needs 3 wives before he can gain his spot in heaven. And so what happens is all the older men take the young pretty wives, and the young boys who are growing up don't have a chance. And so then they get kicked out of the sect and they think they're going to hell. And they have to kind of try and live a life outside of what they know. So it's really traumatic. I also had to do a lot of research on dissociative identity disorder. I really wanted to make sure that I captured that in a way that captured all of these aspects in a way that was respectful. Because these are real people that have been truly harmed and affected by living in this way. And when you have dissociative identity disorder, it's because you've had systemic trauma in your childhood. And so I wanted to capture that in a true way, but also be respectful to those who have suffered that disorder.
Yeah. And then just in terms of a writer telling that story, did you do an outline how you were going to sort
Plotter or pantser? Is that the question?
Well, just because you're, any kind of complex character, but how you let
Plotter.
that information out as a reader goes by without hitting too much in the beginning, or
Right.
Was that a factor?
Yeah. Do you write by the seat of your pants, or do you plot everything out first? I'm a bit of both.
Yeah.
So I started my very first book, The Faithful. I was full on pantser, and it was a tome, and it needed so many rewrites and so much. Of course, it was also my first book, so that was part of the reason. But I think over time, and I knew where I was going, I knew the end, but I had no clue what I was doing or where I was going with it. So with each book that I write, I find I become a little bit more strategic in plotting, although I'm not the kind of, there are authors who will literally plot out every chapter, every scene, every point. And, they basically have like a condensed version of their book by the end of it.
Yeah.
I think that would take the magic out of discovery for me. So I plot the big points, and usually partway through writing a first draft, I have to pause and go, what the hell am I doing? And I don't know where I am or where I'm going, and kind of plot the rest of the story. And then I rewrite 10 million times. Yeah.
I have a question. So when you're doing the research phase, like it involved so much great research. Did you do that before you did the plot, or after doing the research, then you sort of figured out the story, or did you have the story before the research?
Little of A, little of B, because I do find I plot as I have an idea, and it usually leads me to, I need to learn more about that. And then the research often gives me new ideas or gives me more direction. And so I'll usually need to do a certain amount of research before I can actually start writing, just because I need to know enough to be able to do that. But then I do end up stopping many, many times along the way when it's like, okay, now I need to know about this one little arcane piece of knowledge that I have no idea. And so I'll stop and research that one piece and then keep going. Yeah. And then sometimes I have to check my research once it's done to make sure it's actually accurate. Yeah.
And actually, almost to ask you a question, sort of following on the same lines, when you're writing a book such as this one, while another aspect of writing is sort of mapping how that character development is going to go, with this you have some clues and stuff that you have to sort of spread along the way. I get the feeling of that how much of that thinking goes into that in the beginning, or do you have an idea when you want to drop some of those hints along the way, or?
So I know the ending when I start, and I do plot out. Similarly, my first book, I didn't outline at all, and it was very, very I have millions of drafts of that book. Whereas this one, so I definitely have a beginning, middle, and end, and I do a very detailed outline for the first half, but doing it for the second half doesn't work for me, because by the time you start writing, you realize so much can change. You have better ideas, and you kind of have to give yourself some wiggle room. So what I try and do is have a general outline, and every time I have an idea for a red herring or different subplots, I just kind of park it in, and when I get to it, if it still makes sense, then I go with it, or maybe I think of a better idea.
And by parking it, do you mean you just make a little note in the text about it, or do you have a imagination board, or how does that manifest?
I have an outline where in like a very large text document, and each part of the story will have I'll just have random bullet notes, and I'll put them in no particular order, and when I get to that section, I look at it, and a lot of it will be gibberish, and I can just delete it, but some of it will still be relevant and work it in. So
Plotter is an amazing app for anybody who's looking for something to help you kind of plot in different, and you can choose different kinds of stories. Like you could choose a thriller, you could choose a horror, you could choose a cozy, all different kinds of things. And then it kind of gives you the beat sheet that you can then fill in your ideas. And it kind of helps you make sure that you don't have a big gap in your story and if you do, then that's something you need to figure out And it works well for moving things around too as you're
Yeah.
going. Yeah.
Interesting. Never heard of that before.
What was it
Yeah.
about?
It's called Plotter, Plottr. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
Soon they'll have an app that could just write the whole books for us, and we don't have to.
Oh,
we can just show
no,
these
let's
things
not
and
even.
stuff.
Yeah, they do.
Let's not start talking about AI right now. I might
Yeah.
need to cry a little.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. In dealing with, you guys are writing novels. I'm dealing with
Sorry.
nonfiction myself. How often are there situations where you're bringing in maybe something maybe it's something of yourself, of course, but maybe it's some people or something, and working that in? Or have you had somebody say, "Hey, are you talking about me here, or a friend, or a loved one, or something like that?" Or is it never that close? So you're always working within your heads that way.
What about you?
Definitely. Yeah. I would say for each of my protagonists, they're all like South Asian women in their 20s or 30s. And so I just sort of pick a different part of myself and sort of expand on that, or borrow from other personality traits people I know. But I think if I really want to copy someone's character, you have to change. Like I change often their gender or their ethnicity or their relationship to the protagonist. If I were to, just because it allows for more fiction to be like, you don't want to just borrow from real life. I mean, if you put the person in a completely different situation, there's more room to play with it and to make things interesting. So,
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. I definitely there's aspects of personalities that end up in, and sometimes it's just me. I mean, at the end of the day, it is kind of us, right? Taking on different roles. But I always love to put it in little Easter eggs in my books, usually for my husband. See if he'll figure out that one. But Easter eggs for other, old friends or something, where there'll be something like one character who has like a little diamond chip in her tooth, and that's definitely an Easter egg for an old friend of mine, that kind of thing. I like to have fun with that, and then have them call and go, "Oh, so that was my mom, right?"
Yeah. That's good. I'm always envious of the novelists and whatnot, because your imagination sort of knows no better. I have to unfortunately stick to the truth. And there's so many times where I'm dealing with a story that in nonfiction said, God, it would be great if that person just did this instead. It'd open up a whole new vista of options and a great angle. And I'm beholden to the truth so many times. I find that very frustrating at times. I got to stick to the real thing. But
do you ever find like reality stranger than fiction?
Oh, for sure. At the end of the day,
do you have any story, like random anecdotes about things that?
For sure. Well, I'll read a real quick portion of just the beginning, actually, of Vancouver Vice. Vancouver Vice actually sort of came out of another book, a book called Last Gang in Town, which was a look at East Vancouver street gangs in the 1970s, and the Clark Park gang that people had talked about in East Vancouver for a long time. And I originally started as an article for the Vancouver Courier, which was a weekly that was around. It's not around anymore, unfortunately. But when that came out, it was a huge story. It got a lot of attention, because it's really been the first time that I think the gang and some of that era, and that era of the park gang culture that was around in Vancouver in the late 60s and into the 1970s, and really, and even in the 1980s almost, was talked about. And I got a call one day. Receptionist at the paper said, "Hey, there's some old gang member on the phone that wants to talk to you about your article." I thought, "Oh God, I don't know what I said. I don't know what I said now." And it turns out that I sort of met happily the class clown gang member of all these guys, who said, "Hey, I really enjoyed your article. I could tell you some more stories if you wanted to." And so often is the case when you do a piece of nonfiction, as soon as it's out, well, then you're kind of done with the subject for a bit. There's not an immediate need to, go back and add to it, or you can't, because it's out as an article. But I kept his name and number, and it kept sort of coming back to me that I thought it would be interesting to tackle as a book subject, and that's what I did with that book. And as a result of interviewing some retired police, one of the people that's a retired Vancouver Police Department detective in Last Gang in Town, who sort of has a cameo, he called me up and after the book came out, and I said, "Hey, I really like the book." I think it might have been the only book he'd read since like a Louis L'Amour book or something. He wasn't a particularly well-read guy, but I was pleased he liked the book anyway. And he said, "I could tell you some more stories. I was on the Vice Squad for a while in the 1970s." And I went out and met him, and he had drink or two at the pub there and enjoyed talking to him. But he told me one story in about a minute and 10 seconds. And I knew right then and there that was the next book I was going to write. He was such a fascinating, I couldn't believe what he was telling me. And that ended up being sort of the genius of this book. In particular, a murder that happened in Stanley Park in May of 1984. And I thought when I was going to tackle it, because it's a known thing, although it's not a well-known crime within the city, how do you write a murder mystery essentially about a story that everybody knows and the person was already caught and sentenced? So I thought, and because it wasn't that exceptionally well-known, to start with it would be the best thing to do, and then sort of work your way back into the story from that. So I'll just read a very quick sort of excerpt of the beginning, then just talk very quickly about research before we get to maybe some of your questions, not as well here. It was just before 7 o'clock in the evening of Wednesday, May 2nd, 1984, when police and ambulance first arrived on a quiet tree-lined stretch of road on the north side of Lost Lagoon in Vancouver Stanley Park. The weather forecast had predicted partly cloudy with a few showers, but so far the rain had held off. And even though North Lagoon Drive was shaded by a tall canopy of trees, with the forest of the great urban park behind it, there was still plenty of evening light. The late spring sun wouldn't be setting for another hour or so. The report of a suspected homicide had come from the Vancouver Police Department Communications Center at 312 Main Street. Details were sparse in the initial radio dispatch. 2 men at the scene reported finding an abandoned car, a vehicle they said they recognized. They reported that the driver was missing, no mention of a body. It was unclear at the time of how they knew a vehicle or the driver. Later, the police considered the possibility that the two had been trying to break into the car when they discovered a body in the trunk and had fabricated the story to cover their tracks. Even innocent people can make up an alibi when they get nervous and find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. As police from around downtown responded to reports of the abandoned car, some made derisive or even homophobic wisecracks that given the proximity to the gay cruising area along Stanley Park Lee's Trail, the driver would likely be back shortly with a pair of muddy knees, wondering why the police had shown up to begin with. But when details emerged that a body had been found in the trunk of the car, the joking stopped. Police humor is a particularly dark brand of levity that others who don't particularly regularly deal with dead bodies can often find macabre or just plain insensitive. Police, firefighters, and paramedics often shared this sardonic point of view among themselves as a coping mechanism to help them weather the often unrelenting stress of the job, especially if they've done the job for years. Even so, hardened veterans become solemn and put aside flippant jokes when they walk into a homicide scene as an area as public as Stanley Park, especially when there's a possibility that more than one victim can be discovered. The car had been parked on a lay-by big enough for a vehicle to stop on for a short time with uninterrupted traffic on the two-lane North Lagoon Drive. Trees and brush along the roadside gave the spot enough shade and cover to make it difficult to see what or who had parked there when viewed from the south side of the lagoon. I'm going to jump down there a little bit. Contemporary homicide investigations are markedly different from those in the 1980s. If the same homicide had occurred today, it probably would have left to the mobilization of additional 20 more police officers to cordon off the area and perform a ground search to comb for evidence 40 or 50 feet back into the bush of Stanley Park. Today, forensic computer technicians with 3D scanning technology are also regularly deployed to a crime scene to create simulations and maps. The investigation results in enough boxes of reports, notes, photographs, interview transcripts, and documents to fill an entire storage room. In 1984, aside from the immediate search of the area, a few photographs of the car and the surrounding scene, some notes and diagrams, and a handful of interview transcripts, a 1980s homicide case often didn't fill much more than a single large legal-sized folder. Down here a little bit. Joggers and people on their evening stroll around Stanley Park began to stop along the police tape to get a closer look. Some of the officers recognized the victim in the trunk. Casual speculation had begun amongst them. This person was known to police, quote unquote. At this point, one more officer arrived, walking to the rear of the vehicle, and saw unveiled from behind some bloody blankets the body of the victim. And that's when the rain that had been forecast that day began to fall. Staff Sergeant Rich Rollins from the Major Crime Section had marked his 17th anniversary with the Vancouver Police Department the day before. He would become the senior officer of this investigation. I spent a lot of years on homicide investigations, and I saw a lot of autopsies, says Rollins, recalling that day in May almost 40 years later. This ended up being one of the most interesting cases I ever worked. And just when I thought it couldn't get any more bizarre, it did. That's the first chapter. So just to set up the story. When research is a huge thing for me in terms of any books I've written, whether it's about nightclub history or crime history in the city. And I'm often taken, at least a couple of years interviewing people, and there's 70 to 80 interviews per person. And people often ask me, how do you sort of organize all this together and whatnot? And I don't transcribe everything. I kind of got into a system of storyboarding, actually, where I would go back in the interviews that I had. Somebody said something interesting, I would make a note on a little 4x5 card, what the quote was, what the time point was, almost like the time code, where it was on the tape. And I would have different colored cards for different kinds of people, whether they were witnesses or police or business owners or friends of the victim or whatever else. And then I got these two big sort of cork boards from Staples and put them up on my wall, and basically started putting these cards around. And then I knew sort of in the story where I was and what I had to get to as well. And like you say, when you've got a gap somewhere where you think, geez, I need something exciting here to keep people interested, or you just need to get some detail to explain what's going through. That for me opened up a much faster process in writing, because I knew exactly sort of where I was in the book, even though I wasn't there in the writing of it. And these would get pretty complex because people would come by my place and see all these different colored cards and practically string it. It looked like there was a police investigation going on in my home, and whatnot. And sometimes when you're dealing with real people as well, and I'm always somebody that says I'm a historian, not a journalist, even though I've worked in journalism, because I sometimes find people, if you're coming at them as a journalist, they feel they're a little on edge, and they, whatever story they want to share with you, they sometimes can be reluctant to tell, if you're, especially sometimes with the attitude in the media, unfortunately, these days. So I always try and nurture, and sometimes I will say to a person, especially if they're somebody who was involved in something sensitive, be it somebody who was involved in organized crime or somebody who was with the police department, that I'll let you read whatever I've written before it goes to the printers. Which is the first rule of journalism you never do, and probably with history, although it was never mentioned when I was an academic history student. But I just find that's a way to, and sometimes it's helpful just to get the detail. If somebody said, well, didn't happen that day, that's actually 2 different days, Aaron, just if you want to know how, sometimes that's helpful too, just in the minutia of it. But you can often put a lot of people at ease, I think, if people are sharing your stories, which then you're going to weave into your own, and handle in your own voice that way. But as I say, I'm always envious of my novelist friends, if they can pick what the person wants to do, or it has to follow a logic to what they've set up for the characters, of course.
Well, I think it's a little similar sometimes in fiction when you do have historical aspects to your story, or where you do want to check in with people who maybe weren't involved in the story necessarily, but for example, Blood Atonement, one of the main characters is an RCMP officer. So I mean, I was a private investigator, so I understand investigation, but I do not have a lot of knowledge about police investigation or RCMP. So I did reach out to RCMP officers, and I had one who helped me and answered a whole bunch of my questions. And I also did have somebody who I emailed back and forth with who has dissociative identity disorder, just to make sure that I was getting it right.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Because when we do write, they talk about write what you know, but frankly, I think that would be boring for me. So I want to learn something as I'm writing, and that does mean reaching out to the experts.
Yeah, and I think it makes a difference because the reader reads that, gets that truth and can spot something genuine.
Yeah.
Even can't we all, when we read something, it feels like, that sounds right to me, Yeah. With the 10 minutes or so we have, a little bit more than 10 minutes, I wanted to open up in case anybody else had any questions here. Yes, sir. Greg.
This question, I guess, is for any of the 3 panelists. And you were just talking about this, Shoshana. You approached the RCMP, and you did find somebody who was willing to talk to you and help you.
Yeah.
How hard is that, or how easy is that in general, to approach the police and ask them for this kind of information?
The question was, just so for the benefit of the people listening at home who might not have picked up the question. The question was essentially how easy it is to connect with law enforcement, to ask a question like that in our experience or whatnot. Go ahead.
I found I'm always nervous to reach out to people, even if it's not RCMP, or because I always feel like you know, I am a writer. So, you know, you just kind of have that feeling like of, I don't know, like you're not legit or something. But I found over time that everybody is very open and wonderful that I've reached out to about giving me as much information as they can. With the RCMP, they were much more careful about what kind of information they would give me, but she was very, it was a female officer. She was very good about giving me procedural information. So as long as they weren't talking about a specific situation or case or what have you, it was fine to talk about procedure and she kind of was my checks and balances to say, like, 'cause I asked, like, okay, so I have them doing this, and then this. Is that correct? And it's like, yes, but you would also need that in here, that kind of thing. Yeah.
That's great to know because I haven't had to do that. So
Yeah.
It's great to know.
They might be suspicious of you as a law student or with somebody
Yeah.
with a legal background as a lawyer. That they're wondering what am I'm going to be asked about here?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, certainly in my case, to make a long story short, I probably I would, next to Eve Lazarus, probably, and maybe even more than Eve, who I did a panel with this morning. I've been very fortunate to have some very open contacts with retired Vancouver Police Department members. Vancouver Vice specifically interviews some of them. Some of that trust, I think, was gained on Last Gang in Town, and even prior to that with the book on the Penthouse, which deals with the Vancouver Police Department raid in the 1970s that happened when they raided the place. Prior to that, I had worked on a documentary or two that involved some Vancouver Police Department guys. And just in the geniality of working with them, I was doing music for the documentary. Got to know some of them. So when I initially had some questions, they could steer me to some retired guys that when I was researching some of this stuff, if I would call these guys up at their home, they would hang up on me. But if I talked to a couple of people that are well respected in the retired VPD community, I said, I was just looking to talk to so-and-so. Aaron, stay by the phone. I'll call you back in 5 minutes. Less than 5 minutes, he would call back and say, try him now. And then I would call and the guy would talk to me. And God knows what he said, or he just said, look, he's going to be cool to talk to you. I got a reputation, I think, for at least being fair. When Last Gang in Town came up, I thought for sure I was going to upset either the Hells Angels or Vancouver Police Department. And when Christmas came around that year, Brian Honeyborn, who's one of the officers that's focused on the Last Gang in Town, said, geez, every retired cop in the city, Aaron, got your book for Christmas, and they all liked it. And I thought, geez, well, that's a relief. And then I talked to one of the old Clark Park gang guys, who were one of these Hells Angels affiliated people that are around, and they said, geez, every biker in town got your book for Christmas, and they loved it. And I don't know how I managed to get the Titanic through the iceberg field, but I was just pleased that I didn't upset really either side. But in the book, as somebody told me, so you don't tip your hand either way, what you say, how I feel about it. And in many ways, I thought they switched sides. They switched roles at one point. When the VPD starts to bend the law a little bit to go after some of the gang members that are in town, and vice versa, So it's interesting. Usually, the police department can be very, very closed on some stuff. But I've been fortunate enough, and even when I was doing research for Vancouver Vice, I was going to submit a Freedom of Information request with Vancouver Police Department on this homicide file that happened in 1984. And typically, VPD will give you very little, even if it's a closed investigation that's been solved and whatnot. And I talked to a friend of mine who was an inspector with the VPD. He had just retired. And I said, look, I want to ask some questions in this FOI request, but the way FOI requests work is they'll really only answer the specific questions you've asked. So if your questions are too broad, the answers are too broad and stuff like this. And I said, I just want to get an idea of what's in the file, because I've talked to some of the other officers who are still alive today that investigated it, and they told me a few things. And the guy said, well, I'll pull the file for you. And I thought, but how's he going to do that? He's retired, and it turns out he can still go in and ask for a buddy to pull something for him. And he called me one day. He had the file at home. This is incredible to me. And he just read it out to me over the phone. So when I did file the FOI request, the VPD got back to me and said, you've seen the woman knows me there well enough, because I ask her, they see an Aaron Chapman request and they go, we're going to have to go all the way in the back in that dusty box from 1958 or something. And and she said, it sounds like you've seen the file already. How is this? They were kind of upset with me. And I said, well, I'm connected with the family of one of the investigating officers who's passed on. They had some stuff left behind, and they were horrified there was something without of, and it wasn't. I just didn't want to rat on my buddy who was just retired. And they sent me back, 3 pages of measly information. And it was almost nothing. And I said, I appealed, saying I should be able to provide this. And then the woman said, "We know you've seen the file now. Like I don't want to give this to you just because she's got a grudge against me now." But they opened up a few more things of it. But it just goes to show, yeah. So those connections are, I think, you want to talk to a doctor about something. Those are sometimes hard to nurture because those are all questions people are sort of going to ask out of their own time, out of the profession, if you will.
Yeah.
And some people will make time for you, and some people won't. Yeah. And certainly, I know when I'm working on a book, I'm talking to everybody. I'm talking to cab drivers. Do you remember when this happened and stuff like this? Somebody might know something. Somebody might have. I remember my buddy was living next door when that happened. Any number of things happen like this, or somebody has a friend. Geez, I know of somebody who works in that exact field that can tell you how that works or whatnot. So, yeah, any of those connections or how you learn. It's just life, how you learn to tell those stories is going to be, valuable.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Questions? We had time. I don't know if we're overboard here. Oh, we got 5 minutes. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Have you ever thought of writing a book with Mike McCardle?
Have I ever thought of writing about?
Write a book with Mike McCardle?
Oh, Mike McCardle. Well, Mike writes his own books. He does very well as himself. He's a friend of mine. Yeah. No, he does very well. He could write his own book. He doesn't need me. So, yeah.
It'd be interesting if you could do a book together.
Oh, yeah. Maybe one day we'll do something like that. He's kind of got his own beat, though. He doesn't need my help, but we've met before, and we certainly laughed about different ideas and things like that. So he's a super nice guy.
Yeah. I know I met him once.
Yeah.
We're the street. He was reading from
Yeah, he's a great guy. Yeah.
He knows his stuff.
Oh, sure does. Yeah.
Him and the guy at ARE SARA.
Yeah. Squire Barnes does a bunch of stuff there too. Yeah, I've worked with him a lot actually on some stuff. He's been really kind to so many people see that TV news coverage and stuff like that. I did when I was doing research on the Commodore book. They did a feature on the Commodore. I talked about it. We shot this little thing of the Commodore, and at the end of the broadcast, he said, "Aaron's working on a book. If you got any stories, get a hold of him." They didn't put my name or number or anything like that, but I started to get all these emails and calls, people tracking me down. The receptionist at Global said, "Hey, can I just send people your way? I'm getting all these calls today." And very quick story. A woman said that her grandmother had been a nightclub photographer at the Commodore and gone around and taken your picture, which you could buy for 25 cents. It was like a selfie that you paid for, basically, back then. And she was a nightclub photographer in the 1940s in the Commodore. I said, "Oh, wow, geez, I'd love to see some of those photos. It'd be great to see." And she goes, "Yeah, I've got a great one of the coat check girls in 1946. And they're all lined up. Looks exactly the same as it does now, basically a little cubby hole of space there when you get at the top of the stairs." And I said, "Great, let's meet next week." About half an hour later, this 80-year-old woman calls me and says that she was a coat check girl at the Commodore in the 1940s. And I said, "Well, we better meet, I think. I'd love to talk to you." So I met the first lady first, and I got the photograph. And then I went up to West Vancouver, and I saw Dorian Christie. She's passed away now. And she was 83. And as soon as I saw her, I thought, this is a young version of you, So I waited to the end, and I because I didn't want to produce it at the beginning. And I said, "Well, it's something I should show you here. I'd like to get your impressions." And I showed her the photograph. And I can only imagine when you're 83 being shown a photograph of yourself when you're 18 that you've never seen before. Immediately brought her back. I'm getting choked up thinking about it, just seeing how wonderfully she reacted to her face lit up. Seeing her friends, she told me, I had to remember the names of everything about them, and then told me so much more. She would bring more ideas that she remembered and stuff like that. And it was great. It was just, it was a wonderful, and there's those moments like that. You just think, wow, that's a perfect, I just have to write that perfect little moment, in the book and whatnot. And it's fun. It's fun getting out there and doing that research and in that way too, and meeting people that way. Anybody else at the time? I don't want to go overboard here. We've got a couple minutes. So we'll be sticking around too if somebody wants to ask a private question, I think, for at least a couple minutes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yourself, yeah.
You've got a couple of minutes. I might as well ask another question.
Sure.
You talked about the police and approaching them. What about the coroner's office? I understand it's almost impossible to get through to the coroner's office.
It is. It can be done. In fact, there was a coroner here earlier today that
Oh.
was here for the talk that Eve and I gave. And you can sometimes get information from them. I've got it off the record before. I haven't done much in the way of official channels.
So there's no kind of official reports that you can look at through the coroner's office?
It's a whole other subject that would take a
Yeah.
few minutes to talk about. I can tell you about, but depending on when it happened, there's some stuff that in the BC archives in the 1960s and earlier that you can access.
Thanks very much.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, you bet, no problem. And there's stuff today. It's always a matter. Newspapers.com is such a great resource for if you're looking up sort of true stuff. And it used to be that you had to go to the top floor of the VPL there, go through the microfiche, hope that you knew the date it went on, look through the things, move those little wheels around, and hopefully find what you're looking for. Now, of course, you can stay at home in your pajamas and just type it into a keyword search, and you can find those stories. And sometimes find the names connected to it, investigating officer, whatever else, some of the orbiting people, and find those people. And some of them are happy to talk to you, some of them won't, or some of them are dead, But there are ways to do it. It's a whole other subject, maybe with the time we have given. But I'm happy to talk about it later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah. Well, thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank you
Please
for
buy their
joining last
books.
minute, Yeah.
Yeah, please check out their stuff. You can check out mine too,
Yeah.
stuff like that, but check theirs out first.
And the one surviving member
yeah.
of
And the one surviving member of the panel. What happened to Charlie and Sam? It's a great murder mystery.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Thanks, guys. Check out Word Vancouver, and it's a great festival. I really like the way Word Vancouver specifically focuses on Vancouver writers and Vancouver people. I know the Vancouver Writers Festival has Vancouver writers too, but so often Vancouver Writers Festival is a bigger festival that has international people come through. The nice thing about this festival is it's all people like us that are here and writing and telling those local stories, or at least we're local writers talking about other cities in that regard. So it's a great festival, and I think it has deserves all the support it should get. So check it out. Follow it online. Follow it on Twitter, Facebook, all that stuff, and we'll see you in the books somewhere. Yeah.